Welcome back, adventurer and scholar. Nat 20 Academy is delighted to see your face once again in our hallowed halls of learning. This is part 2 of our D&D 5e Basics video series. The first part, Setting the Stage, introduced you to the basic concepts, history, and vocabulary of the world of D&D 5e. This second video, Tools of the Trade, will introduce you to character creation, reading and understanding your character sheet, and the various dice that you'll encounter in gameplay. The final video, Playing the Game, will walk you through what happens in an actual game session and teach you the basics of gameplay. To start off this video, ask yourself this: what do you want to be for Halloween this year? In D&D, one of the first things you do is create the character that you're going to play in that game. You want to choose a character that you're going to enjoy playing. For the purposes of this video, we're only going to deal with the character choices that come from the most basic resource, the D&D 5e Player's Handbook, or PHB for short. This handbook provides you with all the classic D&D character options, but it isn't too overwhelming. In time, you can explore the richness of the published additions to the Player's Handbook, or even create your own races and classes with Homebrew. But for now, let's stick to the basics. That is, after all, why this class is named D&D 5e Basics. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to walk us through creating a character and reading your character sheet using a digital tool called D&D Beyond. There are a number of digital resources out there. I am using this tool because I'm familiar with D&D Beyond. It's a fairly commonly used tool, and it is tied directly to the content of the official D&D 5e publications. Feel free to use any tool or tools that you find work for you in your process. Alright, let's build our very first character. Remember, we're going to use something called D&D Beyond in order to do that. So you need to go and find that particular program. Go to your search engine, type in D&D Beyond, and it should be one of the first things that comes up. When you first get an account with D&D Beyond, you'll need to build that free account, and then you can go in and build your character. Once you have your account set up, you can do something called, you go into something called Tools and click on Character Builder. This will bring up your options. We're going to do a standard build. The others you can figure out later. Most of this we're going to sort of ignore. This is setting up the preferences of what your character sheet might look like, as well as making some choices in what gets used and doesn't used. For right now, turn off all of your source options because you're only going to be using the material from the basic handbook. Everything else can be left as is because it doesn't really matter. Then go to the next page where you're going to choose your race. I happen to have more resources than just the basic rules, so I'm going to ask it to just bring up the basic rules. This is what you'll have access to with a free account. You have a number of race choices that you need to make. Who do you want to be? Do you want to be tall and thin and somewhat ethereal? Do you want to be strong and stout? Do you want to be big or small? You have options and choices available to you. In the basic handbook, you have the choice of the following races, or species, if you will: Dragonborn, Dwarf, Elf, Half-Orc, Halfling, Human, Rock Gnome, and Tiefling. And if you don't know what all they are, click on the little arrow next to it, and it will describe what they are and some of the features and characteristics of the individual. For the purposes of this demonstration, let's pretend that we want to be a Dragonborn. I click on the blue arrow that will give me all the information of what a Dragonborn is, what their traits and characteristics are like. They'll even take me to a detailed page if I click on this link. And it tells me a little bit about some of the characteristics, including something called a breath weapon, which a Dragonborn has. If I'm happy with my race, I choose it. And then it often will give me some choices. Anything that I have to choose or make a decision about appears in a blue box. All I have to do is to click on the down arrow, and it tells me the information that I get to choose from, and then gives me the option. In this case, I'm choosing the breath weapon that my Dragonborn has, and that's based on whatever color that Dragonborn happens to be. I am very partial to fire and to red, so let's be a red Dragonborn. Once I've made those choices and decisions, everything is filled in for me, and I can go to my next page where I get to choose the class. This is the vocation for my character, what they do for a living, if you will. They kind of come in two different categories. Fighting types who deal damage both through hand-to-hand combat and weapons, or spellcasters who do their damage by casting magical spells. The basic classes have a number of these individuals, and you need to decide, first of all, what do I want to do? Who do I want to play? Well, I'll be honest, one of my favorite characters to play is Robin Hood. That's my ranger, so let's make my Dragonborn a ranger. Again, it will pop up with a menu to show you some of the various things that go into making up a ranger, what they're able to do, and choices that you'll need to make. Now, a ranger is sort of an interesting character because it has both fighting capabilities and a little bit ability to use magic, so kind of a hybrid class. I like playing Robin Hood, so I'm going to choose to add this as my class. Again, now I'm faced with some decisions about what I want my character to be. Here is something called Proficiencies. This is very important. You need to pay close attention to this box. Click on it and it will tell you what you are proficient in and what you are going to use for what are called saving throws. You're going to use two main abilities, strength and dexterity. So when it comes time to actually build this character, I'm going to want those to be two of my highest scores. Now I'm faced with some other choices. I need to choose a ranger skill. I have lots of options open to me based on strength and dexterity. I can be skilled in animal handling, athletics, insight, investigation, nature, perception, stealth, survival. Lots of goodies in here. And the investigation is generally a very helpful skill to be proficient in. That lets me investigate my environment and see if there's something tricky or odd going on. I can also select a second skill. It will drop out the ones ahead of it. I have animal handling, athletics, insight, nature, perception, stealth, and survival. Stealth isn't a bad one to have, so let's be Stealthy Ranger. And finally, I have one last ranger skill that I get to choose from. You've seen this list before. Animal handling, athletics, insight, nature, perception, survival. Well, perception is also not a bad one to have, but as a ranger, nature is kind of my gig, so I have to choose. But I'm going to go with perception. I think maybe it'll be better use of my skills. I also get to choose a favored enemy, someone that I know a lot about, and I have studied this particular foe, and I have lots of information to offer to my friends when we are fighting things. These are all the different kinds of things that I can have as my favored foe and therefore would know something more about them. I don't honestly know what might be the best thing to have, but let's say I want to know a lot about undead. All right, there we go. If I'm ever faced with an undead foe, I'll have a little bit of an advantage and more information on them. Now I have to choose a language. Every character in D&D Beyond is able to speak a language called Common. It's a language that everybody speaks, but other people have other kinds of languages that they can speak as well. So sometimes it's nice to know someone else's language. You have a long list of them, and you have to decide which one works for you. Well, I am going to be a Dragonborn, and I am automatically going to speak Draconic because it's who I am, so I get to pick a second. Let's say I've got a really good friend who's a dwarf who's taught me how to speak Dwarvish. Sure, why not? Now we have to choose Natural Explorer, the kind of ranger I am. So do I belong on the Arctic, in the coast, in a swamp, in the Underdark? This particular ranger comes from the mountains. All right. Then I'm going to go to my next page, and this is where I pick my scores. All right, buckle up. This is where numbers come into play. This is where math is introduced to D&D Beyond, or D&D in general, and is also the place where your eyes start to cross and uncross. But hang in there. It's not nearly as bad as you thought it was, and with digital character sheets, it's actually pretty painless to produce a character. All right. In D&D, you have 6 basic abilities that are critical for your character: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. All right, very quickly, what are those? Well, think of them as tomatoes and what you can do with tomatoes. Strength is the ability to squish a tomato. Dexterity is the ability to juggle tomatoes. Constitution is your ability to eat bad tomatoes. Intelligence is, I know that a tomato is actually a fruit, and therefore its seed is inside. Wisdom, on the other hand, is knowing that while tomato is a fruit, it does not belong in a fruit salad. Charisma is the ability to convince someone that tomatoes in fruit salad is actually quite delicious. You're going to want to choose your ability scores. You can do that in a number of ways. There's 3 that are presented to you in D&D Beyond: a standard array, a manual roll, or a point buy. I'm not going to explain all of this to you. We're just going to go with a standard array for this particular character. What that does is it gives you 6 scores to choose from that go from slightly below average to a little bit above average, and you decide where you want to plug those in. Now, remember back a bit ago we talked about what our strength saving throws were, and you wanted strength and dexterity as your 2 highest scores? Well, that's what we have right here. So I want strength to be my highest score. So I'm going to go and put my 15 in there. Dexterity, my other high score, I'll plug in my 14 in there. Now, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, I have to make a decision about how important do I think those are to my particular character and how I'm going to portray that character. So are they going to be individuals that can stand up to a lot of activity and have that constitution? Well, a ranger out in the wild, that would make a certain amount of sense. So I'm going to plug my 13 into constitution. Now I have to know the difference between intelligence and wisdom. Book smarts versus street smarts. Well, I'm a ranger. I think wisdom might be kind of important, so I'll plug my 12 in there. Now it's down to intelligence and charisma. Do I want to be a friendly, jovial Robin Hood or a standoffish, brutish, sort of unlikable Robin Hood? Or do I want to be a really book smart Robin Hood? Well, the truth is both of these scores aren't really going to help me be really great at either one of those. So I have to choose what I want. Well, my ranger never went to school, so I'm going to put intelligence as an 8 and a charisma as a 10. 10 is an average score. There's nothing wrong with it, and 8 really isn't all that bad. So there I have scores. I plug them in, and then some things get to shift and change. For example, strength, because I'm a dragonborn, I'm super strong. And so while I plugged a 15 in there, that score is actually a 17 because I added those 2 extra racial points to it. I also have a racial bonus in charisma, because as dragonborns, I'm just naturally cool, I guess. All right, now I have my scores. The rest of the information I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail right now. There's a whole course on putting together a character, and we'll walk through this in detail. But this really talks about the specifics of your character. What do they look like? Where did they come from? Who are they aligned with? And what's the things that motivate them? These are all critical questions when it comes to role-playing your character, but for right now we're going to gloss over it. When I'm done with that, the next thing that I get to choose is equipment. Well, you can't go into battle empty-handed, so you might as well make sure you've got everything on board. So the first thing I'm going to do is collect my equipment. As a ranger, I have options between wearing scale mail and leather armor. Well, I have to make a decision here. If I'm a ranger, I may want to be sort of stealthy rather than clanky. Scale mail makes me a little clanky. Leather keeps me a little quieter. I'm going to go for stealth and choose leather armor. I can wield 2 short swords or 2 simple melee weapons. It's kind of up to me. Well, I kind of want to like the 2 simple melee weapons myself, so that's what I'm going to go with. So what do I want? Well, I have lots of choices. I happen to like Yaqualas quite a bit. They're kind of like a little short sword on their own. And then I'm going to add to this a hand axe, because not only can I use it as a weapon, I can always chop down trees to make fires with it. It seems very practical for a ranger. I have two choices of the kinds of basic packs I have, a Dungeoneer's pack or an Explorer's pack. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference, but I prefer the Explorer's pack just personally. And then because I'm a ranger and I'm playing Robin Hood, I get a longbow and a quiver of 20 arrows. Yay! I'm going to add that equipment to my inventory. Now, it's very important to understand that if I do not equip something, I can't use it when it comes time to have battle. So I have to decide if I'm going to have my hand axe and my Yaquala out, or if I'm going to have my bow and my arrows available to me. Now, arrows are something that I can shoot at range, so sometimes it makes more sense to have your ranged weapon ready before you have your close combat weapon ready. So I generally equip my arrows, my armor, and my bow. Once I've clicked on these, they're ready for use. I still have my hand axe and I've got my Yaquala, but they're stored on my belt or on a back, and I don't have access to them until I equip them. All right, that's literally everything. Once I'm done with that, I get to view my character sheet and take a look at what it looks like. We're going to go into the character sheet in a little more detail using a completed character that I put together. But here is our little Dragonborn that we just managed to put together. Here are their ability scores that we threw in, and all the other information that goes with them. We'll walk through what this sheet means and what it tells us about our character in just a moment. Once you've rolled all those dice and come up with all those numbers, they get shipped over to your character sheet. This is what you'll use during gameplay to understand your character, to figure out what to do, and to figure out what all the dice rolls in D&D are about. Let's start by understanding our character sheet just a little bit. Starting up at the top with the easiest bit. Up here are the demographics for your character. Your character's name, their race, their class, and their level. And for most, a cute little picture. Here are what we call your ability scores. These are the big numbers that you rolled when you were creating your character. Down here are the actual rolls for each of your abilities: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Up here are displayed your modifiers, the amount that you add or subtract to a roll based on what ability you're doing and how well your character does with that particular ability. Down here are what we call skills. These are more refined versions of your ability scores. They come directly from them. So, for example, acrobatics, which involves things like being able to dance along a line strung between two different buildings, or to dance along the edge of a bathtub without actually falling in. That comes from your dexterity scores. Just general strength, the ability to knock someone over or to do something that requires you to run into something, that's athletics. And that comes directly from your strength score. Over here is something called your proficiency bonus. This is an amount that's added in for any score in which you are proficient, that is, particularly skilled. You'll know that you're proficient in a skill because this little black dot over here gets blacked in. So your wisdom gets a proficiency. So anything that has to do with wisdom, you get a bonus. Over here are something that is known as saving throws. These are things that you do when you get yourself into trouble, or when you're about to get into trouble. Someone is slinging a spell at you and you have to dodge out of the way, or maybe you're in the process of dying. These are your saving throws, the things that will hopefully get you out of trouble. Down here is something that are known as senses. These are related to your ability scores, but they are what we call passive abilities. So passive wisdom, which is perception, is just your general attentiveness to what's happening around you. Now, sometimes you'll be asked to make a specific insight or perception check, But in this case, your passive perception can also be used to determine if you notice something in your environment. Up here at the top is something called your walking speed. This tells you how far you can move in a particular turn and how quickly you can move through the environment around you. Up here is something referred to as hit points. This is essentially your health bar that you find in video games. Every time that you get hit or hurt, you lose a few points. When someone heals you, you gain points back, so you heal or damage. This score is something called an initiative bonus. When you're asked to roll for initiative, that is to determine where you fall in the order of turns in combat, you add this bonus to your d20 throw. This is something that's called your armor class. This really tells you how much you can stand up to things before you end up taking damage. The more armor you wear, the more plating that you have, and the stronger you are, the higher your armor class will be. I've pulled the sheet down just a little bit so that we can see the bottom part of it, because there's some information here that you need to know as well. Over here are basic proficiencies in languages for your character. What kind of armor are they skilled at using? What kind of weapons can they use? What tools are they proficient with? And what languages do they speak? Over here is a big box of all the things that you have somewhere on your person that can do all kinds of interesting things. Here you'll find not only the things that are in your backpack, but your weapons, as well as what you can do with weapons and spells. So let's start here. This is your inventory, everything that you happen to have. The important things to note here are things like armor and weapons. They need to be equipped or ready to be used in order for them to count when it comes time to play the game and beat things up. So make sure that those are marked before you go into battle. D&D Beyond is nice because it will help you understand what you're able to do in a particular turn. These are listed as actions. So this lists everything that you could do on a turn. You could hit someone with your crossbow, you could hit somebody with your warhammer, or you could take an unarmed strike. Next to the Actions tab is the Spells tab. If you happen to be a spellcaster, someone who can use magic, this is where you'll find the information on all of the spells that you can sling about past the spell. We'll talk about those in a little bit. You're limited on the number of slots that you have during a day, so you want to learn to use them quite wisely. There is more to your character sheet, but let's not take the time to go through it now. You'll learn more about that when you create your first character and when you learn how to actually read your character sheet in detail. What we've done here is just give you the basics. The next important tool of the game are the dice. Let's take a closer look at the dice that you will use in playing D&D. You have in front of you a set of 7 very pretty, oddly shaped pieces of real or digital plastic. Your first question is likely to be, why? Well, remember, one of the authors of this story are the dice. They are the voice of chance, of fate, of karma. They enter into authorship when you propose an action for your character that's beyond ordinary everyday activities. In D&D 5e, you don't have to roll a dice to see if you're successful in ordering a glass of milk at the local eatery, but you can bet your bottom dollar that you'll have to roll if you want to liberate the prize heifer from old Farmer Brown. Each dice serves a slightly different purpose in the game. Each is distinguished by the number of sides that it has. When you refer to a die, you call it by D and the number of sides that it has. A D20 has 20 sides. A D8 has 8 sides, and a D6 has, you guessed it, 6 sides. It's the one that looks like an ordinary old die. The number of sides on a die sets up probability related to the chances of succeeding on a task or inflicting damage on something. The more sides there are on a die, the higher the potential value for a roll. A D4 has 4 sides, so the maximum that you could roll on a D4 is 4. However, there are only 4 values, and so you have a 1 in 4 or a 1/4 chance of rolling a 4. And those aren't bad odds. On the other hand, a D20 has 20 sides, so the maximum value that you can roll is 20, which is a lot. However, you only have a 1 in 20th chance of getting that value, so odds are a little steeper. However, you also have a 50-50 chance of rolling a value over 10. The dice you use reflect how damaging the blow or the spell can be. Just punching someone is usually a D4 worth of damage. You can hurt someone this way, but without some significant exceptions, it's not usually deadly, and so not a lot of damage is dealt. On the other hand, a great sword, wielded with the power of 2 hands and all your strength behind it, ought to do a little more damage than a punch, so you would roll a 2d6 to determine damage. Wait a minute, you say. Where did the 2 come from? In this case, you would actually roll 2d6 die and add them together. Okay, let's quickly go through the dice in your set. We're going to go through the dice from the largest to the smallest. A D100. Your dice set will not come with one of these. They're always purchased separately. They are a very large die with 100 sides. No, they really exist, and they look more like a golf ball than a die. They are for rolling percentages or percentiles. For those of you who understand statistics, I apologize. This is one of the places where smart people have failed to educate the masses. Percentages can also be rolled by using 2 D10 die. I'll explain that a little bit later. The D20 is the most frequently used die in your set. It's used to determine if you're successful in doing something that you propose, like hitting a creature with an arrow fired from your bow or slipping a letter into someone's backpack unobserved. You can roll a D20 to determine if something hits, to do an ability check, to do a skill check, to make a saving throw. For any of these things, you roll a D20 and add or subtract the appropriate modifier to the value of the die. The maximum value on a D20 is 20, and when it comes to determining if you hit something with a spell or a weapon, or when doing death saving throws, the values of 1 and 20 take on an extra meaning, referred to as critical failures, or critical hits, or critical successes. The D12 is usually rolled to deal damage for heavy-hitting spells and larger weapons, and for the likelihood of certain things happening on DM tables. The poor D12 gets used infrequently and is often considered the most unloved die of your set. The D10, there are usually 2 of them. They're distinguished either by 2 different colors or by the fact that one has single digits and one has double digits. These are referred to as percentile dice. Typically, they are rolled as a pair, 1 dice with the double digits referring to the tens place in a percentage value, and 1 with the single digits referring to the ones place in a percentage value. They're used primarily to determine the chances of a thing happening at that moment. Aside from wild magic tables for the sorcerer, not much happens with these dice. A single-digit D10 is used for damage rolls for some weapons and spells. The D8 is used in lots of damage rolls for spells and weapons. It's not uncommon to have an extra bonus amount that's added to this roll, or to roll more than one of these dice. The D6, this one looks like a regular old dice. It's used for lots of damage rolls for spells and weapons, and it's not uncommon to have an extra bonus amount added to this, or to roll these dice with more than one of them. And finally, there's the D4. This is the Lego of the dice world. Stepping on a D4 hurts more than stepping on a Lego, but they generally come in smaller numbers, so their overall damage is a little less. They're usually used mainly for low-level damage from weapons and spells, and from unarmed strikes. Again, it's not uncommon to have an extra bonus amount that's added to this roll, or to roll more than one of these dice together. Well, I can see your first question coming up. So when do I roll, and how do I know what to roll? Well, there's good news. Your DM generally tells you when you need to roll, so you don't have to guess. Directing the flow of play is part of the job of the DM, so just let them do their thing. It's a lot easier that way. When it comes to what you roll, a digital character sheet with a dice roller will almost always do it for you. However, you will quickly come to know that you roll a D20 for initiative, to see if your weapon or your spell hit, and for many of the checks that you're asked to make. You generally add or subtract a bonus amount to these rolls based on the purpose of the roll. Again, most dice rollers will do this for you, but at some point down the road, you really should learn what these values mean and when they are used and why. All right, that was a mighty hefty and rapid tour of the tools that you'll be using in your first game of D&D. Don't let it intimidate you. You're in charge of your character and character choices, and the more that you play a character, the more comfortable that you'll become, and the more willing you will be to branch out and try new things. It's important to know that most players have dozens of characters that they've rolled up, and you generally play a new character in each game in which you play, so you'll have lots of chances to play around with all the various races and classes that are out there. As for the dice, just follow what the DM tells you, and you'll soon pick up on how they get used. Well, that concludes Part 2, Tools of the Trade. When you're ready, go on to watch the third video in this series, Playing the Game. Here is where we'll take all of the knowledge that you now have and see how it gets used in actual gameplay. I can't wait to see you back here for the third and final video. And remember, Volventat Marte, roll for initiative.